Beating his little green coffee can drum, Chris rolled his eyes as Roland swiped one stout arm around Ada's slim waist and pulled her into his lap. Chris changed his rhythm to something deep and primal as his friend whispered a soft something in his sister's ear. She threw back her head and laughed appreciatively, her long black tresses blowing freely in the wind under her white felt hat. Chris sighed. Continuing the drumbeat, he looked north on the deserted road between Meeteetse and Thermop. The three were waiting for travelers who would have left this morning. If their timing was right, that group should show up any time now, on their way to the good camping spot where Grass Creek crossed the highway. Spring had brought warmer weather, and most of the snow had melted. Large mud spots were everywhere on the ranch road, in the pastures, and in the draws. Green grass had sprung up, and the ancient sage cast off its distinctive scent as it grew again. The high peaks in the distance were still white, but the rocky ridges and lower flats were dotted in verdant green. Everyone had been grateful to change to felt cowboy hats and leather chinks instead of the heavy canvas coveralls. Hearing his heavy carnal rhythm, the two lovers giggled to each other, but thankfully separated and rose to their feet. Ada checked the road and then opened the coolers. She ran her hand over the contents. Chris scoffed, as if anything could have shifted or broken. They'd all learned to pack the coolers well since the weather had improved in the last few weeks. Roland tucked his heavy denim shirt back into his jeans and checked the horses tied along the fence. Chris shook his head sourly. At that moment, he missed Jessalyn intensely. For a short time, the other Tarin was resting at their place, and he'd hooked up with the pretty girl. For a while, he'd felt less left out, while both his sisters allowed the two Emerson brothers to pursue them. But Jessalyn had left a week ago. She was on her way to Cody to find her father. Then she was headed up to Powell, where her mother lived. And Chris was stuck here, at his home, watching calving cows or building little wagons. Not going anywhere, not following Jessalyn or headed northwest. And his dreams plagued him every night. A few people appeared on the rise of the highway, coming down from the north. The adults, carrying heavy packs, were well armed. Stout knives were at their waists, along with the studded clubs folks had begun to use, and several men carried heavy compound bows. Children slugged along beside them, and 4 little fuzzy-haired dogs pranced at the end of short leads. The group was obviously tired, but this part of the road was not a good place to stop for the night. As they watched the group slowly come closer, Roland laughed softly. Not stopping his drumbeat, Chris asked, "What?" His friend answered, "I was just thinking, we are all starting to look a whole lot like that bunch out of The Walking Dead." Ada joined in his quiet laughter. "No, we don't have any firearms. We're more like characters from Assassin's Creed or Ragnarok." With a small gesture at Chris, she said, "But the game music is really lame." Chris grinned and changed his singing, well, more like reciting, to the lyrics of Wayfaring Stranger. Ada hitched her belt up. A hatchet swung from one side, and 2 knives were in makeshift scabbards on the other side. And no one tells you how heavy all this stuff is. My hips are killing me. I'm seriously thinking about making myself some kind of harness that goes over my shoulders, makes me stand tall, and helps me get the job done. The approaching group visibly relaxed on hearing the soft song. People were desperate for music now. The silence of their new world grated on everyone. Stopping to listen, the tired children sank to the ground to take a small rest, mesmerized by the rough performance. One of the men quietly asked Roland how much further it was to the next spot with water. A boy of about 5 stared at Chris intently. "What's wrong with his face, Mom?" His mother shook his shoulder, shushing him with an embarrassed smile. "Don't point, Ethan.
That's not polite." But Chris finished playing and gave the kid an earnest look. "I wanted to get a tattoo, but something went wrong. Now I have these scars." He shook his head and grimaced. "Don't ever get a tattoo on your face, right?" Beside him, Roland chuckled softly. Chris started another simple, tuneless song, and Ada said, "You've come a long way on foot." One of the men shrugged. "None of us know how to ride." Roland, his beard almost as heavy as his father's, gave a sympathetic nod. "Horses can be a lot of trouble." Ada failed to keep a condescending smile off of her face. Their horses stood behind them, hobbled and patiently waiting to ride home. Roland continued, making a gesture of openness. "We'll trade you 3 more tunes for whatever news you can tell us." A gray-bearded man said, "You won't have to pay us for news, but we won't turn down a few more songs." A woman, older and heavy-set, sank to the black pavement, groaning with relief. She rubbed her legs above her stout boots. "The prepper guys from Matitsi are charging us for using this road now," she said. "Can you believe that? We had to give them a can of food for every person in our group." While Chris beat his rhythm on the red toffee can, humming the 3 notes he knew he could make, Roland asked, "Did you pay it?" One of the men rolled his eyes at the woman, but he nodded and said, "They are patrolling now, going after wolves and coyotes. Just wish they'd patrol the whole road, not just 20 miles each way." Another woman handed a plastic water bottle to one of the kids. The little girl took a drink and gave it to the next one. The woman, not much older than Ada, said, "Several miles south of Cody, a whole group of people were getting killed just ahead of us. The wolves were still snarling over their bodies when we got there. We had to go right round in one of the pastures to avoid them." Ada gave the young woman an earnest look. "You were lucky. Nowadays, if they see it all, they will leave their kill to come after you. They've been crazy since..." She adjusted the weight of the belt at her hips. The 2 long knives and the small axe they all carried now could get heavy. Tilting his black, high-sided cowboy hat against the wind, Roland asked, "What prepper guys are you talking about? We usually get up somewhere around here, but we've never seen them. And we're only about 17 miles out." The first man, the oldest one of the group, set his pack down and rubbed his shoulders tiredly. "One of those prepper groups that everybody used to call crazy before. A couple years ago, they brought some old church camp just outside of Matitsi and set up shop there." Ada hugged her work coat closer as a chill breeze buffeted them. "Oh yeah, I remember hearing about that." Chris fixed her with a curious look, and she continued, "You were away at college when all that happened. Wasn't really important to tell you." She shrugged at him. He said, "Well, if there are preppers, why are they asking for food? Shouldn't they have huge basements with stock shelves?" Roland grinned and added, "And shouldn't they be hiding, staying away from everything?" The older man said, "Apparently they took in a whole bunch of people in need." The young woman dropped her voice to an affronted whisper, "Only young, pretty women or big fighting men." For a few moments, only Chris's drumbeat and hummed notes could be heard over the sound of the wind rising. Looking at the dark gray clouds gathering in the sky, the leader picked up his pack. "If it takes another hour to get to the camping spot, we'd better get going." The women exclaimed in loud protest. "Wait, they have milk and eggs? We want to trade with them." While their men impatiently urged them to hurry, they quickly exchanged several cans of vegetables and fruit for milk eggs, yogurt, and butter. They were tough hagglers, and Ada, looking at the tired children, gave them a small jar of milk for each. In the meantime, Chris and Roland found out that the families had had to leave Cody because it was all Mormon now. They had been told to join the Mormon church or to go without the resources that the town had managed to commandeer. These travelers were some kind of special Baptist sect and had refused. They had heard their church in Thermopolis was still welcoming their people, and now they were hoping to join there.
After the travelers continued on their way, Chris, Ada, and Roland quickly packed their trade goods into the big coolers that had been adapted to be panniers, but only after taking a can of chew from the trade goods and sharing a dip. Roland put the little can into his shirt pocket. "We don't have to tell anyone else of this one, do we?" Chris grinned wickedly. "No, we don't. Besides, there are two more." Low blue-gray clouds began to race across the sky. The wind started to gust stronger and colder. They quickly secured the panniers on the two pack horses, ensuring they wouldn't shift. They might have to travel fast if they wanted to beat this squall home. Getting good old Shaky and taking the lead of the quiet little red mare, Ada said, "Next time we have to pack up earlier. I hate riding in cold spring rain." Roland mounted one of the colts Mackenzie had started, a big rangy Palomino gelding. For the first 10 years of his life, the Yellow Horse's claim to fame had been keeping the backyard of a nice, wealthy doctor's wife mowed. Taking the lead of the other pack horse, a solid little bay, from Chris, he turned his big mount towards home. When he led the bay out, the cans inside the coolers shifted with a loud rattle. The bay swiveled his ears in alarm, but followed the lead nicely. The big Palomino, however, spooked and skittered sideways. The pack horse trotted to keep up with the lead, and the cans inside the plastic again clattered noisily. Using only one hand on the reins because his other hand still held the lead, Roland spoke reassuringly to his horse. Then he gave a loud curse as the affronted Palomino wheeled, grabbed his butt, and tried to race away. Watching the wreck develop, both Ada and Chris broke out in laughter. Grinning wickedly, Ada followed at an easy trot, the little red mare dealing with the noisy panniers by raising her head, quickly swiveling her ears, but following the lead. Chris pulled his bay colt close and vaulted into his saddle. He turned Mac after Roland and raced to catch up with the crow hopping side jumping Palomino. Urging Mac to top speed, a small part of his mind registered how well the 3-year-old handled the terrain, sagebrush, and occasional mud spots, rocks. Little Mac had gained a lot of experience in the last few weeks riding Night Watch. When he passed the crow hopping Palomino, he paced Mac slightly ahead of the older horse. Chris had done this for his mother since he was 10, just old enough to race across the sage and keep control of his mount. "Put his head on Mac's butt," he called to Roland. For several strides, the Palomino continued to try to dislodge Roland from the saddle while clattering pack horse followed close at his heels. Then the Palomino saw his younger pasture mate and began following. With flaring nostrils and swiveling ears, he hooked onto his buddy. Chris led the way, turning a slow circle across the small flat. The Palomino began to settle and to respond to his rider's signals. When they all slowed to a trot, Roland began to laugh. "Yeah, ooh-ee," he cheered with a wolfish smile. "I got a little Western." Chris laughed as he adjusted the fringe of his chinks against his legs. "It's a good thing that old bastard can't buck hard enough to throw the hat off your head." Patting the Palomino on his rump with the hand still holding the lead to the pack horse, Roland said, "Don't listen to him, Pally. I thought you gave it a good try." Ada caught up, cheering loudly. "Oh, that was awesome. I wish I could have got a video of that. It would have made a great TikTok." As Chris helped Roland work the Pally over again, teaching him to accept difficult situations, a part of his mind was on the time before. The TikToks, the Instagrams, the YouTube shorts. How entertaining they had been. It had been like meeting new friends from far away. Everyone laughing, rejoicing over the small, everyday victories. It had been such a fun way to demonstrate your skills while at the same time receiving tips and advice from others who might live hundreds of miles away. Ada grinned at her beau, saying, I thought you already did all this earlier when we left the place. His breath coming in fast gasps. The Palomino had begun to settle into the lesson. Roland said, Old Pally's still a little slow on the uptake. Then he added, Who does he belong to, anyways? Ada, a sure enough pretty picture with her dark hair flowing wisps about her face and her light felt hat low over her dark eyes, said, That rider lady over on Cottonwood Creek. His name is Moonlight. Mom traded her for some stuff from her greenhouse. Roland's expression became affronted. You mean I'm doing all this for salad? Ada smiled as she urged her big sorrel to keep up. Yeah, we like salad. He shook his head, his dark hair sticking out under his black felt hat. I'm going to ask for extra pay for all this. Chris laughed and headed up the first steep ridge, skirting around rocks and a few leftover snowdrifts. Good luck with that, then he added. Isn't she the one we're building the two-wheeled cart for? Ada nodded, guiding the pack horse trailing her skillfully. Yes, and Sweet Moonlight here is supposed to pull it. Chris sat quietly as his bay's horse's feet slipped in a muddy spot beside one of the old drifts. Well, I think me and John can put that cart on the back burner for a while. Darling Moonlight will take a few months before he's ready. They crossed a couple of ridges. Moonlight was now riding quietly, accepting the noises. When they rode over the last ridge and started down the long slope, their first hayfield along the creek appeared below. Ada suddenly said, Is it terrible of me that I'm glad we're getting all the cows out of here tomorrow? Roland caught an easy trot down the other side. No, it's not. Well, I'll be glad that we don't have to feed 15 bales every single day. Chris stopped abruptly, letting the others go ahead. He noticed that new little weed just behind a rock and an old gnarled stand of sagebrush. He'd insisted they pull in the fresh grasping shoots around the edges of the house. Nobody was happy about that, especially not Crazy Kaylee, who'd had to do most of that work. Seeing it here in the pasture suddenly explained the forbidding landscapes of his dreams and the dread that accompanied them. It had been frightening enough to see that little vine pull down all manner of structures, buildings, bridges, towers. But what if it also pulled down the fences? What if it covered the grass in this sparse country and choked out the feed for their animals? To find it here, in their fall pasture, sending viney little feelers up sagebrush, was terrifying. Roland and Ada slowed, then circled back to him, managing the pack horses easily. Roland's brown-eyed gaze was curious. What are you looking at, bro? Did you find more wolf tracks? When Chris silently pointed at the young plant beginning its climb up the rough base of the old sagebrush, his black-bearded friend said, What is it with you and this stupid weed? Ada gave a wicked grin. Maybe he wants to smoke it. Chris only shook his head, foreboding filling him. I don't think that would be a good idea. Once the cows find this, you're not going to like what it does to them. Roland turned back towards their home, resuming a walk. Is it going to kill him? With a look at the darkening clouds, Ada and Chris followed. He said, No, but I think it will make them crazy. Like loco weed on crack. Concern painted across Ada's features, and she asked, What about the horses? Chris shrugged. I imagine we'll find out soon. They are hunting anything green right now. If they find a little sprig of that, one of them will try it for sure. Then he gave Roland and Ada a wicked grin. And I will be back, making carts and wagons with John Braver while you guys will still be Mom's crash dummies for the new colts. Ada laughed good-naturedly. Let's just hope none of them find it before we take the cows up to the spring pasture tomorrow. Before turning back to follow Roland, Chris moved his glove and allowed the Tarin inside him to rise. Using a small, concentrated stream, he scorched the new little plant. Ada shuddered. Oh, I hate it when you do that. I hate when your face turns into... Chris smiled, keeping his Tarin strong. He knew his eyes held a red glow, and the little scars across his face were raised and red-tinged. He let his Tarin bring fire into his mouth as he said, "What? Like this?" Flames erupted from his lips with every word and then dissipated across his face while his eyes still gleamed with that inner luminosity. Ada gave a small cry. "God damn it, Chris! Quit it!" He only chuckled as he let his Tarin subside. A long, deep wolf howl could be heard from the west. It was almost immediately answered by another coming from the east. A gust of wind that smelled of rain blew across the ridge, and with a long sigh of relief, Ada urged her horse to speed away. Chris and Roland followed her, long trotting down into the Grass Creek Valley. A few minutes later, they trotted up the ranch drive. Rusty and Tidbit left the feeding crew briefly to bark at their arrival, then returned to the pasture. Setz, still recuperating from his injuries, ran off the porch to greet them. In this silent world without any machines running at all, their clattering pack horses seemed very loud as they trotted into the yard, and every horse in the corrals, along with their 4 milk cows, spooked and ran as far as they could. Even John rushed out of the barn, holding little Jada May in his arms. He'd had to stay home today to watch the baby, as she'd come down with a cold. She began to cry at their noisy arrival, and he shushed her and waved at them. Then he retreated into the barn where the new family had made their small sleeping quarters in the tack room. The 3 dismounted and tied their horses. Working together quickly, Roland and Chris took the coolers off the pack saddles and carried them up the house, while Ada began leading the horses into the barn to be unsaddled. Crazy Kaylee held the door for them, and Miss Coral came to inspect their trading results. The smell coming from the stove was tantalizing. As the 2 women exclaimed over the new cans and packages, Chris said, "Now don't be cabbaging onto those cans of chew, ladies." The 2 women's laughter followed them as they returned to the barn to take care of their mounts. They met Chris's mother there, carrying her own tack into the barn. As the cold April rain began to fall and the sky darkened, Chris's mother turned loose the colt she was working with and put her equipment away. Bruce, Trin, Letty, and Tuff also came in from doing the evening chores. Trin gave Chris a curt nod. "You better go saddle another horse, son. With those wolves close, you'll have to ride night watch for another night." With a gesture, he indicated the cloudy sky outside. Chris had already figured that. Those wolves were close, in the immediate area, and it was hard telling if this was just a spring squall or an actual storm. If it was the latter, then any late cow that hadn't had her baby yet was sure to be thinking about it tonight. And without the electricity, the big yard lights were useless. Only Chris with his firesight could see anything in the total blackness. When he turned Mac loose in the horse pen, he caught Dumbledore and brought the old gelding in. While he saddled, the others waited as they visited about the day's events. Closing the old tackroom door with extreme care, John joined them. With a relieved sigh, he reported the baby was sleeping for now. Chris, for his part, was more relieved to hear the 2 dads, Trin and Bruce, discussing the need to get a couple more hands to help them. There were long lists, plural, of things they needed to do over the warm months, and even with their 2 neighbors, Jake Wolf and Keith Brown Bear, helping now and again, they would never manage them all. A few days later, the cows had been brought to the spring pasture without incident, and Trin, along with Crazy Kaylee, had taken up residence at the cow camp. Now it was early afternoon, and as Roland guided the newbie team over their first rise, Chris looked back at the little cabin. The camp was a beautiful spot. Set at the edge of a long meadow, shaded by massive pines, the little log cabin looked like a picture from an Out of West magazine cover. The new grass growing on the meadow was a fresh, verdant green, and the dark pines in the forest made a stark contrast. The deep blue spring sky was laced with a few clouds, but the warmth of the sun, bathing the meadow in golden tones, had made the friends shed their coats early on. Chris waved a friendly goodbye to Crazy Kaylee just as they topped the rise, and the cabin disappeared from their view. Roland smiled wolfishly, his teeth white against his enviable full black beard. "Tell me I'm wrong, but didn't Dad look as happy as a dog chewing on his favorite toy?" Chris laughed. "About time, if you ask me. He's been alone for so long." Roland adjusted the lines in his hands, urging the little sorrel to catch up to his bay partner. Way too long. Me and Tuff have been telling him to start dating for years. Then he shook his head. But crazy Kaylee? Miss, I'm an influencer. Chris leaned down off the wooden platform that made the wagon's base and checked the axle springs. They seemed to be adjusting just right, making the ride as smooth as it could be on the little pasture road. Did I tell you how she threatened our dad with a lawsuit because we wouldn't cook her a hamburger? In the warm afternoon, even his heavy denim shirt was beginning to be too hot. Putting the lines in one hand, Roland stripped his silk scarf from his neck. He handed it to Chris, who tied it to the sturdy boards making the headache rack. Chuckling, Roland said, I would have loved to see that. Must have been epic. Chris nodded his own scarf there. It was. Dad carried her all the way down our driveway to the blacktop road and shoved her back into her little car. Chris jumped off the wagon seat, the back seat of the car he and John had converted into this wagon, and let it go by him. Now he walked along, checking the back axles and their springs. Everything seemed to be working well. The team was walking quietly, and Roland looked back at his friend. Everything okay? It rides good. Front axle swivels well. You and John are kind of getting the hang of this. Chris jumped on the back of the wagon and clambered over the upholstered seat. He's a good hand. Knows how to use all the old tools and the new ones I welded together with my fire. I'm just tired of his mouth. He gets his panties in a twist over everything. Rolling his eyes, he let out a weary sigh. I know that's why Dad sent him to get more oil and grease from the oil field today. He knew I needed a day off from all that bitching. Their odd little rubber-tired wagon crested the last rise before dropping down onto the Grass Creek Valley. Snow still lay in patches here, and the spring melt turned the yellow clay to mud and the grass green. They would have often had used the four-wheel drive in a pickup, but the horses simply stepped over to the grassy spots, and the light wagon moved along easily. From here, it was another 6 miles, and mostly all downhill. Roland exclaimed in surprise. What the hell? When Chris followed his gaze, he saw a large plume of smoke beginning to rise over the ridges. Isn't that about where home is? Roland stood up, holding onto the headache bars at the front of the flatbed. Yeah, that's definitely our place. Hold on! With that, he whipped the team up. The horses lifted their heads in surprise, but obediently began their lope down the hill. They only managed to control their pace for short moments. Then the downward momentum, the leather harnesses slapping them in their sides, the wagon bumping at their heels, pushed them into a flat run. They still traveled in tandem, the harness keeping them together, but they desperately wished to separate, the left horse wanting to take the lead while the other turned his nose in to follow his partner. Roland exclaimed in a loud whoop as they crossed the spring pasture in record time, the wire gate approaching at an alarming rate. Chris stood beside Roland, crouched low to keep his balance, one hand gripping the headache rack and the other clamped to the back of the car bench. As he realized how fast the gate was coming up, he exclaimed, "Oh, shit! Oh, shit!" Through gritted teeth, Roland growled, "Hang on!" Then he guided the team to make a big circle through the pasture. The wagon was hurled up in the air as it sped over sagebrush and rocks, and Chris felt the team give another lurch of speed. But crouched low and leaning into the lines, Roland controlled their wild run as Chris struggled to maintain his hold on the wagon. The empty coolers and sack of laundry Trin had sent down bounced out of the wagon and were left behind. Chris hung on for dear life as Roland managed to get the horses to run in the direction he wanted, and they continued to bounce across sagebrush and rocks. The stout Emerson kid smoothly pulled them up when they approached the wire pasture gate the second time. Laughing wildly, Chris jumped out of the wagon and ran ahead of the agitated horses to open the gate. Roland talked to them softly as they pranced through. "Leave it open, and we'll come back for all that later," he called to Chris, indicating the clothes and the coolers with the tip of his felt hat. He barely waited for Chris to get one foot onto the wagon bed before he urged the horses into a run again. Back on the 2-track road, the going was smoother, but still Chris stood beside Roland, hanging on to the headache rack. He kept an eye on the plume of smoke rising from their home. What the hell happened? In response, Roland urged the team to greater speed. They crossed Sadakin's pasture in record time. The horses began to huff each breath as they reached the place where they ran, not because they were frightened, but because Roland made them. Chris kept his eye on the smoke turning into a large black column. Roland eased the horses to a stop at the next gate, and Chris jumped out to open it. When the team trotted through, Chris could see that they kept their ears on Roland and his instructions. Where the leather of their rig was touching their sides, white lather had begun to form. They crossed the last pasture, both horses and wagons slipping and sliding through long, muddy spots. At the final gate before the Grass Creek Road, Roland only halted long enough to allow Chris to jump out to open it. Leaping back onto the wagon as it rushed past, Chris took a good hold of the headache rack. When the wagon stabilized on gravel road, Roland had the team racing again. On the smoother ride, Chris trained his eyes on their home. He had a good view of the ranch yard as they flew towards it. It was hard to look away from the burning house, but Chris trained his focus on the barn, outbuildings, and corrals. With a shaky voice, he reported, I think that's my dad and Tough lying in the yard. They're not moving. Roland made an inarticulate sound and urged the team to greater speed. Chris continued to examine their home, holding on as the wagon slid sideways across old, hardened drifts and mud sections. The horses valiantly kept their feet on the varied footing, running all out. Oh, house is really burning now, and some of the corral gates are open. I don't see any of our riding horses. I can't see the milk cows either. Chris reported what he saw, knowing Roland had to keep his attention on the team. They turned up the driveway, and the wagon bumped wildly through the dip beside the cattle guard. The horses scrabbled to keep their feet, and Roland and Chris held on for dear life. The burning building roared and crackled, but drawing closer to it and the barn, Chris continued to look for movement, for any sign of those who should be here. His mother should have been in the corrals working her colts. Ada had gone with Tuff and Bruce to fence off the new garden spot along the creek this morning. Tuff and Bruce were here, but where was Ada? Letty had gotten in trouble for mouthing off about something and should have been cleaning saddles and bridles in the barn. Eth had come down with that cold and should have been in the house with his mother and the baby. Oh, where were they? With a quick look down Grass Creek Road, Chris spotted a rider leading a single pack horse. John Braver was coming toward the ranch at a jerky run. He had yet to get the hang of riding. Turning to look the other way, Chris saw 4 more riders racing towards them. Their neighbors, the Sadakins, along with Jake Wolf and Keith Brown Bear. No doubt they had seen the smoke and were coming to help. There was no sign of Trin and Crazy Kaylee coming down through the pastures. Hadn't they seen the smoke plume yet? Chris turned his attention back to their home. A dog rose beside Tuff's prone form to give a short alarm. Sets barked. Then, recognizing them as they approached, he limped back to Tuff and lay down. Rusty left Chris's father's side and challenged their arrival. The big border collie met them halfway up the drive, growling yet wagging his tail. Tidbit was usually with Chris's mother, but she hadn't appeared. Where was the little dog? Where was Mackenzie? When they reached the ranch yard and the backside of the barn came into view, a short groan escaped Chris. His mother lay against the barn wall, her form in a blood-soaked, twisted heap. Even as Roland pulled the team up and threw the lines away, leaving them trailing across the headache rack, Chris jumped out and ran to her side. The horses, their sides heaving, walked on, their feet unable to stop, but too tired to run anymore. Roland ran to Tuff's side, crying out his brother's name over and over, and the younger kid moved his hand feebly. Some old reflex made Chris reach for his back pocket, searching for a phone. He wanted so badly to call 911. He wanted a fire department to come, racing up the driveway, their sirens blazing. He wanted EMTs to jump out of a stout square wagon to take Tuff away and transport him to where a slew of doctors could help him. He wanted someone who knew things, to take his father away.
deny the arrows in that stout man's chest. He wished for a helicopter to land in the yard to transport his bloodied and battered mother to the big hospital in Billings. Somehow, people with all kinds of technology at their beck and call could make this all right again. But there was no phone. And there would be nobody. Nobody to help. Nobody to make things right again. And the big fire behind him called Chris, beckoning him. But he turned towards his mother and gently pulled her towards him. Rage coursed through him as he saw her terrible wounds. Gashes and deep rents covered her torso, arms, and head. Tidbit, the smallest border collie, lay beside her, as bloody and torn as her owner. He cradled his mother's twisted, bloody form close. The markings across his brow and cheeks throbbed, and where his hands held her, smoke began to form. Then he saw her swollen, bloodied lips move. She breathed weakly. Growling deep in his throat, he released her. His Tarin was rising with his rage. He held his hand away from her and struggled for control. He knew his eyes glowed with their red light as he now said, "I'll be back, Mom. Just hang on." His mother's eyes fluttered and fixed on his, and he knew she realized his dilemma. He added, "Help is coming." He went to his father. 2 stout arrows stood out against the big man's chest, and another in his arm. Keeping his hands turned away, he laid a wrist against his old man's shoulder. It only confirmed what he already knew. It was too late. Life had already left. Chris dropped his head, giving one soft, grieved exhale. Rusty came to his side, wagging his tail and putting his nose under Chris's arm. But his Tarin, rising with his grief, prevented him from comforting the tough big dog. The crackling house drew him, pulled at the Tarin inside him. Chris called, "Roland! John and the Sadekins will be here any minute." His friend had been snapping questions at his half-conscious little brother, but the younger kid only shook his head in confusion. Chris indicated his mother lying beside the barn and called, "Take care of my mama." He turned towards the burning house, glad to finally be able to come to the fire's call. "I'm gonna look for the others." He strode towards it, squaring his shoulders, the scars over his face pulsing. Fire licked from every broken window across the porch and up the sides. If anyone was left alive in the house, he alone could find them. He and his firesight, and his ability to withstand the scorching, the burning. Every second counted now. Something inside the house gave a loud roar, and the flames strengthened and rose higher. Some sane human part of him thought, who in their right mind walks into a burning house? But his Tarin already flooded him. There was anyone left alive inside, he alone could save them. He was a fire Tarin. Then conflagration was his element. It was his to command. Flames escaped from the front door and fled across the porch roof. He walked under them. The stench of the white plastic siding melting in the heat imbued his nostrils. The crackling, hissing flames filled his hearing. Inside, the walls of the kitchen were already ablaze. He let his firesight scan the room, but it showed him nothing. Only fire rising up every wall. He rushed to the baby's playpen in the middle of the kitchen. A deep, bloody gash had ruined Jada May's little chest. The baby had been killed not by the flames or smoke, but by the men who had set them. But Chris had no time or room for grief. Quickly, he wrapped her lifeless form into a blanket and carried her outside. Her father had arrived, and careful to keep his Tarin away from the bundle, Chris placed the wrapped body in the man's arms. Closing his mind to the soft groans of grief, Chris turned his heel and hastened back into the fire. Striding through the house, making the flames pass him by, he opened every door, every cupboard as he searched for his people. The kitchen, the living room, Tuff and Roland's room and Tren's room, they were all empty. He even looked under the beds, not trusting his fire sight to show him true. In every spot he looked, he desperately hoped he would find someone. When they'd all been much younger, they'd often played hide-and-seek here while their parents played MGT in the living room, drinking and smoking a stormy day away with their neighbors after the essential work had been done. He knew every nook and cranny of this house. As he searched room by room, he soon found that while the flames couldn't hurt him, the smoke filling every room could. He opened the window of Tren's bedroom and leaned over the windowsill, letting his head drop to gasp in the fresh air as the fire and smoke rushed out above him. All through the house, the signs of a fight were plain. His people had not surrendered to their attackers easily. His lungs filled with clean air, he continued his search. His clothes burned. Even his heavy leather boots would soon catch fire. For now, though, they saved his feet from broken furniture and shattered glass. By the time he reached the door to the basement steps, his clothes had been burned away. He descended into his family's sleeping quarters with only his belt above his waist and those heavy leather boots still on his feet. Here he could smell the leftover traces of burnt oil and gas. Flames licked along the top of the staircase, flaring along the ceiling. He turned to his fireside, searching for anything cooler than the scorching basement. Their trunks and dressers had been pushed over. Across the floor, their clothes made large flaming piles. The curtains divided their sleeping sections had long been burnt away, and he could easily see each of their bunks. Only in one corner did he find a cooler spot, the water heater. He knew that spot well. Behind it, there was enough room to shelter a kid. "Letty! Letty!" he called with the last bit of clean air in his lungs. She was small enough to fit in there. But he needn't have. He was answered by a coughing fit from behind the tubular arrangement. He ran to thrust his hand behind the little space. His fingers closed on a sweatshirt and he yanked it towards him. But it was Ethan's limp form that fell into his arms. Pulling the boy along, he went to his own bunk. He opened the basement window above it, and the fire immediately flowed out, filling this new channel with flames and smoke. There was not even enough room between the edge of the window and the ground outside to get a good breath of air. Ethan would never survive going through that. The heat from the flames rushing through the window was just too intense. If Chris shoved the boy through, the kid would burn. Dropping the kid's arm, Chris gathered the flames to himself. The flares and flames, burning clothes and licking up the walls, he gathered them all. Power filled him as he took the blazes and built a furnace in himself, through himself. An inarticulate cry escaped him. The ecstasy of so much fire, the rapture, it was almost too much. Yet he continued to gather all the maelstrom around him and feed it into himself. Then, with the power turning into euphoria, he routed the raging burn up along the ceiling toward the staircase. Holding the flames, feeling like they would overwhelm him at any moment, take him into their grip and sweep him away, he fought them for control. Chaos turned into a stream, and he felt like he could piss himself from the ecstasy it brought. Only one little thought in the back of his mind made him kick the boy lying at his feet. Ethan opened his eyes to look at him, terror in his gaze. Chris adjusted the flames rushing through him to form enough of a pocket that his voice would work. He doubted the kid at his feet would even understand when he heard himself. He sounded like the most evil, terrifying monster from any movie.
"You have to get up, Ethan,"
he snarled, expelling flames with every syllable.
"I will hold the fire, but you have to climb out on your own.
He knew the eyes he'd turned on the boy were blazing with his Tarin. He tried one more time.
Ethan, you pussy, get tough or die.
He gave the kid another kick in the side.
Get up. Right now, right now.
Ethan stirred himself, then came to action with hastened motions. He used the leather belt around Chris's naked waist to pull himself to his feet. He climbed up on the burnt bedding, each step crackling as spent fabric collapsed under him. Then he weakly grasped the window frame. Realizing the kid was waiting for someone to help him, he growled,
Ethan, nobody can do this for you. I'm holding the fire. Climb out.
The boy only clung to the frame with his hands, not making any effort to crawl through.
God damn it, if you want to live, man up and climb out this window.
Turning slightly, Chris put his naked knee against the wall, still holding the fire and forcing the flames to go up the staircase. Finally, he felt Ethan's foot, find the anchor and push himself up a little further. His throat making no more than the deepest growls, he yelled,
Gut it out, you little wimp!
Still directing the flames from the burning piles on the ground, from the wall, and wrestling them up along the ceiling into the staircase. He bent over to give the kid another foot up. The boy found his back, stepped on it, and then pushed himself out the window. He fell across the sill and into the dirt on the other side. Still channeling all the blaze through himself and up the inside of the house, Chris growled at him to get away from the window.
Run, boy. Run!
But Ethan only lay below the window, gasping weak breaths of clean air into his lungs. He coughed and hacked, then gasped for more air. When he finally began to move, he crawled only a few feet and then lay down to cough more. He looked at Chris with wide, terrified eyes. Chris groaned again. As he continued to funnel the blaze away from the kid and up the stairs, even his hair was now burning, the flames coming out the ends of it, flying past his face towards the stairway. He didn't know if he should laugh or weep. The ecstasy was so intense, the feeling of power so absolute that he hated to let the flames go, but he knew he must. Even if he could not contain the inferno much longer, eventually he would burn. He could feel the place to the north and west calling him as he held on. That place was granting him strength, for now. But even as he used the added power, he knew he would have to pay it back, and soon. But when he tried to release the conflagration, he found he could not. It continued to funnel through him. He was no longer directing all of it. When he'd shielded the boy, he'd built a heat channel along the ceiling and up the stairs. Now the fire tried to tear him to pieces, tried to pull him up that passage. He yielded to its force, fighting to hold himself together. He took more power from that place, the place he hadn't gone to yet, and the fire swept him away. Up, up, up and through the house. When he reached the roof, his passage blew a hole into the sheets of metal. As he rose above it, every part of him aflame, the rest of the roof fell with a shriek of twisting metal. He fought to keep himself together, to keep himself whole. Every hair on his body expelled sparkling flashes, not just the hair on his head, but the hair on his arms, the hair on his chest, on his legs. Even the hair between his legs blazed as he struggled to release the scorching inferno. Fighting free from the stream around him, he let flaring torrents flow from his hands. They took him outside the conflagration, into the clean air over the ranch yard. There was still too much fire in him, and he continued to feed it through his hands. The force of it, the bliss, almost made him let go and allow himself to be swept away into the sky. But seeing the form of his father on the ground below him, his abused mother, beaten and bloodied, as well as the thought of his missing sisters, it all kept him from funneling the blazes away. People in the ranch yard, his neighbors and his friends, gaped in wonder as Chris rode the impulsion and allowed himself to descend. Oh, how that direction hurt. He was fine. fire. He only went up. But now, with bottomless regret, he expelled the blazes. He threw his head back and roared, flames escaping his mouth. Then, thankfully, he felt cool ground below him. Fire still issuing from every pore, he took one staggering step, then fell to his hands and knees. Roland, never slow to react, rushed to one of the water barrels. Filling a bucket with icy water, he brought it back and dumped it over Chris. The effect was as much of a relief as it was a regret. As Chris allowed the cold to penetrate, he sorrowed over the lost ability to join the inferno. How much easier would it be to simply follow the blazes, to rise with the flames and smoke into the crisp, clean air? Another bucket of water drenched him, and he held up a hand. Enough, he groaned. But Roland ran to refill the bucket, then returned and threw the ice-cold water over Chris once more. Despite Chris's protests, some reasonable, some human part of him was relieved. Roland crouched by his side. Did you see her? Did you find her? In that moment, Chris had forgotten who he'd gone into the blaze to find. For now, all he could utter was, Ethan. Still on his hands and knees, as naked as the day he was born except for his leather boots, he pointed to where he'd left the kid, around the corner of the house. I found him, and I got him out. John turned and raced to find his son, the small body of his baby daughter yet in his arms. Gripping Chris's bare shoulder, Roland slowed his words and repeated, You were looking for Ada, Chris. Did you find her in there? Chris gathered his wits. He whispered, No. He took a deep breath, taking in the lonely, cold spring air, the forlorn wind blowing from the desolate Wyoming mountains. No Ada, no Letty, no Miss Coral. Another deep, shuddering breath of grief drained him, and he added, They weren't in the house. He felt a coat settling over his hips. Gripping the garment around his middle and settling on his heels, he looked up into Drew Sadikin's face. The elderly rancher smiled wryly. Cover up, boy. My Sandy doesn't want to look at your bits. His wife tied their saddle horses to a corral rail and rolled her eyes with a grin. Then she rushed to Mackenzie's side, murmuring soft, comforting words. Looking at the men still gaping at Chris around the yard, she shouted, Someone catch that team and get the wagon over here. We'll need to load Mackenzie and Tough up and take them to our house. They're going to need a lot of doctoring. Jake Wolf gave an acknowledgement, but stopped beside Chris before following her order. Fixing Chris with a cautious gaze, he said, Are you all right? Dude, how are you even alive? Chris took a deep breath of cool air. I'll be fine. Keith Brown Bear gave a small laugh. I always knew there was something weird about you. Up till now, I just thought it was your taste in women. His nod was decidedly approving, though. Drew called the big Arapaho to his side. We're going to have to go after them, so let's take Bruce and put him in the barn. Later, when we come back, we'll bury them. With a clatter of hooves, Trin and Crazy Kaylee raced into the yard. Trin reined his big gray gelding to a rearing stop, screaming a deep cry of grief at the sight of his family home going up in flames. His eyes were sharp as an eagle's, and fury rode in his voice. Chris! God damn it, what did you do? He vaulted over his horse, closed the distance with 3 strides, and tackled Chris to the ground. I'm gonna kill you for this! In his shock, Chris didn't offer any defense as the stout man's fists fell on him. He stammered, It wasn't me, Trin! But the older man did not hear him. Roland, wrapping both arms around his father, tore him away. Dad! Stop! It wasn't Chris! The house was burning when we got here! Trin staggered away from Roland, rubbing his face with both hands and making small noises of shock. With another glare at Chris, he asked, Well, can't you do something, boy? Chris only shook his head. A weak voice called from the wagon bed. Dad? Upon hearing Tuff's voice, Trin wheeled about and went to his youngest son's side. Tuff leaned up on an elbow, white-faced with pain. Blood still trickled from his scalp wound, and his voice shook as he said, It was that bunch from Matisse, those prepper guys. With John's support, Ethan climbed up into the wagon, coughing harshly. As he settled into the cushioned seat, the boy said, Yeah, they took my mom. Letty, Ada. I thought they'd also took Miss Mackenzie, but she's still here. Crazy Kaylee sobbed a small cry of relief on seeing Mackenzie's unconscious form in the wagon. Clutching her phone like a talisman, she jumped out of her saddle and went to Mackenzie's side. Will she be all right? The black-haired girl sobbed. Sandy Sadakin said, We'll do all we can for her. Then she addressed Trin and her husband, saying, Well, we have to go now. Mackenzie's bleeding from a dozen spots. She climbed into the wagon seat and took up lines. As the elderly lady turned the team about and urged them to a trot, Drew called after her, I'll get these guys going. Then I'll be home to help you. Chris didn't stop to watch the wagon go. He went into the barn. The other men would organize fresh horses for them, whatever weapons and provisions could be found, but he needed clothes. The fire still called him, but denying its allure was easier now. It had, after all, almost killed him. He found his father wrapped in a horse blanket in one of the calving stalls. Sighing in the man's essence, he laid a hand on his shoulder. Not bothering with any useless apologies, he stripped his old man of the blood-soaked clothes. John came into the barn, still holding the bundle containing his dead daughter close. He watched Chris for a moment, and he said, Dude, I can let you borrow some clothes. They didn't burn our living quarters. Chris didn't pause as he hurriedly put on his father's jeans. I'm just about Dad's size. His stuff will fit me. But when he buttoned them, he had to smile. Not quite the same size. He would need to make another notch in his father's belt. John shook his head, then turned to the old tack room where his family had made their bunks. He gently placed his bundle into the baby's crib. Returning to the stall, he said, You are sick, man. How can you loot your own father's dead body? Chris took the work-worn felt hat and put it on his head. Squishing it tight over his scarred brow, he said, I'm gonna go get my sisters back. And your wife. Putting Bruce's long knife in its sheath and hanging one of the small axes from another belt loop, he said, Are you coming? Are you gonna ride with the Sadakins and Crazy Kaylee to go take care of our injured? John angrily flipped Chris off and stormed out of the barn. But only a short time later, not only John, but also Jake Wolf and Keith Brown Bear rode with Chris, Roland, and Trin as they pushed their horses hard over the pastures and gullies.
This is Camon, reading Wyoming, Tarins Rising, House on Fire. This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series. If you've listened this far, you owe us a like, and if you enjoyed it, you should subscribe as well. The story was narrated by Camon Rain and is written by Ashakery Dart.
This story and artwork is copyrighted on February 6th, 2025.